post-war years, sailors made up the largest contingent of London's beggars. Of the history of slavery, I had little knowledge. Research into that subject, the extent of British involvement, and in particular details of the conditions in which men, women and children were transported, the latter in harrowing numbers, proved long and grim. Africans' engagement in enslavement came as another discovery. I have written about and spent much of my life reflecting on Africa's colonial past. Southern Africa was the world into which I was born and raised, and which, well after I departed as a young man, bequeathed a longing that drew me back as a news correspondent and to travel across the continent from east to centre and south. West Africa's history opened a further door. In seeking to distill these worlds, I've been bound to pass over a great deal of history. The transatlantic slave trade lasted nearly 400 years, while ships and vessels of the Preventative Squadron spent more than half a century, 60 years in all, cruising off West Africa before it could be said that battle had been won. The most comprehensive study of the squadron's campaign is Peter Grindal's Opposing the Slavers, a work to which I returned repeatedly for the overall picture and have cited throughout. Grindal was a long-serving Navy officer, and his landmark work was the product of experience, meticulous research and care. It is no disrespect to say that the vastness of his canvas obliged Grindal to pass over some of the individual stories, nuances and details cast up by a more narrow focus. What emerged most strikingly from my research were the voices of those drawn in by the campaign, in Africa as well as at sea, women as well as men. The period, the start of what has been termed the Age of Reform, was one in which views and values were evolving both significantly and rapidly, and the accounts of witnesses, and often their actions, speak for the heartfelt instincts of common humanity. Of those who served, many died, and some were traumatized. The resources for telling this story were highly variable. While naval records for the Preventative Squadron are comprehensive, most of the documents relating to Bahia's slave trade were destroyed in the 1890s, and research done on my behalf at Salvador's State Archive brought little to light that had not already been set down in previous studies. The Henriqueta's life is thus darker than that of the Black Joke in more respects than one. The most significant gap, however, lies in Africa. The archives in Sierra Leone, relating to the men, women and children rescued from slavers and resettled in Africa, have deteriorated, yet been salvaged and digitised, thanks to the efforts of academics. But no amount of doctoring or research can bring to light details of the millions of Africans carried into enslavement, or their personal stories from origin to destiny. As to the central figure of this narrative, the Black Joke herself, she was, it should be said for the sake of clarity, never a ship. In the age of sail, that term was applied to a square-rigged structure of 3 or more masts. As a brig, she had just 2 masts, and was otherwise described as a vessel. In seeking a metaphor for this object, launched as an agent of suffering, but seen as a thing of exquisite beauty by seafarers, I was repeatedly drawn to a piece of music by a great composer, the master of German Lieder. Amid the outpouring of masterpieces that defined the final months before his death in 1828 from syphilis, aged 31, Franz Schubert penned perhaps the most haunting of all his songs. Der Doppelgänger is a dead or dying man's vision of a tormented, ghostly double of his younger self. In another definition, the word doppelganger represents an evil twin. As it happened, the Henriqueta had at that point just set forth on her mission of rescue as the Black Joke. Prologue. 10 years after Napoleon sailed into exile on St. Helena, the frigate Maidstone stood at anchor off another tiny Atlantic landmass. Prince's Island was an unlikely refuge, scarcely 10 miles by 4, and lying just 1 degree 37 minutes north of the equator within the Gulf of Guinea, but for the flagship of the Navy's latest campaign, it provided a welcome respite. In September of that year, 1825, the temperatures of equatorial Africa were tolerable and the tornadoes had passed, along with the wettest weather. From his quarterdeck in West Bay, Commodore Charles Bullen could look out on dense jungle, a land of green swept by the jagged outline of spent volcanoes. With its rich soil, abundant vegetation and sweet scent, Prince's Island had resources essential to his squadron's well-being, and in this week at rest, Bullen indulged Maidstone's hands. Off duty, men dangled lines from the forecast.